Good day, everyone. We are now on Chapter 18, the Cardiovascular System, the heart. This is Part A. There will be a Part A and a Part B to this chapter. The heart is actually two pumps with two distinct circuits. The heart has two side-by-side pumps. The right side of the heart receives oxygen-poor blood from the body tissues and cells, and then pumps this to the lungs in order to rid the blood of carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen gas, O2. The left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs and then pumps the blood out to the body tissues or cells. We refer to the circuits in the cardiovascular system as the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Pulmonary refers to the lungs, and systemic means out in the body. So from the right ventricle, blood is pumped to the lungs, and then from the lungs, blood returns to the left atrium. This is called the pulmonary circuit. From the left ventricle, blood goes out to the body, and then it returns from the body back to the right atrium. And this is called the systemic circuit. Now, in the heart, of course, there's the four chambers. The top two chambers are called the atria, and the bottom chambers are called the ventricles. So the receiving chambers in the heart are the atria. The right atrium receives blood that's returning from the systemic circuit. The left atrium receives blood returning from the pulmonary circuit. The pumping chambers are the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary circuit, so the blood will go to the lungs, and the left ventricle will pump the blood into the systemic circuit out to the body. And here is a diagram that represents the circulatory system. And you can see the pulmonary circuit up here, systemic circuit here. So let's start in the right ventricle. And of course, this is deoxygenated blood. It's represented in blue. So the blood goes from the right ventricle in order to pick up oxygen and get rid of CO2. And then the blood returns to the left atrium. With the systemic circuit, blood is pumped from the left ventricle. Nice bright red oxygenated blood from the left ventricle goes out to the body tissues and then will provide those tissues or cells with oxygen and pick up carbon dioxide, and it goes back to the right atrium. So here are the two circuits. Let's look at heart anatomy. For a while, the adult heart is about the size of an adult fist. It is located in the mediastinum, beneath the sternum. Its base is toward the right shoulder, and the apex points toward the left hip. The apex is the pointy part at the bottom. And when we say apical pulse, this is referring to where we hear the heart beat. I'm using air quotes, beat, because it's not really beating, but we do hear the sounds from the heart at the strongest at a location that would be at the fifth intercostal space and then the left midclavicular line. So body landmarks are important to know so that you can assess things more properly. And in this assessment, listening to the apical pulse, that depends on listening. We call that auscultation, using a stethoscope. And this location is the area where that impulse or pulse would be heard the loudest. And here it is, right here. So we can go down the mid-clavicular line. Here's the clavicles are not shown, but it would be around here, and then the fifth intercostal space. So it'd be right about here. That should be the loudest area where you can hear the heart sounds. And here's a cross-section. Here's that mediastinum. This would be, of course, a cross-section dividing the body into the superior and inferior portions. This is showing the front of the body, anterior, and back here is posterior. And then it's just showing, actually, this is the body of T7 vertebrae. So we're looking at the location of the heart in the mediastinum with this figure. And here it is in the front. They're showing the location of the heart and the various external structures on the heart there. There are some coverings around the heart. The pericardium. The pericardium is a double-walled sac. The most superficial layer is called the fibrous pericardium, peri being around, cardio referring to the heart. This fibrous pericardium protects and anchors the tissues there and prevents overfilling of the heart. Then there's a deep two-layered covering, and this one is called the serous pericardium. And the serous pericardium is actually divided into the parietal layer and the visceral layer. So the visceral, remember, parietal would be out toward the body cavity, but the visceral layer is clinging very tightly to the organ here, and we call this with the heart the epicardium. And between the parietal layer and the visceral layer in this serous pericardium, there's a little bit of fluid there. It's the fluid-filled pericardial cavity between these two layers of the inner layer or inner covering. And this is showing you an illustration. Out here we have the fibrous pericardium, then we have the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, pericardial cavity in the middle, and this is the epicardium. It clings very tightly to actually the heart muscle called the myocardium. And then there's endocardium toward the center, toward the chamber inside the heart. Endo means inside. There is a condition known as pericarditis where the pericardium is inflamed. And what you may hear with the stethoscope is called pericardial friction rub. Cardiac tamponade is when there's excess fluid in the pericardial cavity between those two layers of the serous pericardium. Excess fluid will actually compress the heart, and this can be very dangerous. So the layers of the heart wall from the outside starts with that epicardium, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, and then the myocardium is the heart muscle. This is the most significant large layer. The heart muscle consists of spiral bundles, and these are contractile cardiac muscle cells. This is actually supported by a connective tissue cardiac skeleton. So it's a structure that supports the heart muscles, all the layers of the muscles, and keeps it together. It anchors the cardiac muscle fibers, it supports the great vessels and the valves, and it limits action potentials to specific pathways. The endocardium is actually continuous with the endothelium that we find within blood vessels. The endocardium lines the heart chambers and covers the valves. And I'm not going to click to this right now, but you can when you're looking yourself. And this is actually a link to an article that talks about why we can transplant pig heart valves into a human, and that's because the endocardium can actually be removed, because we don't want to have any cells that can generate a rejection of that transplant. And here again are the layers, the pericardial layers and layers of the heart wall. And this is actually showing the circular and spiral arrangement of these cardiac muscle bundles in the myocardium. It's quite complex. So now we're going to look inside the heart. The chambers of the heart include the two atria at the top, superior, and then inferior to the atria we have the ventricles. There's an interatrial septum. Remember, a septum separates some chambers usually. The interatrial septum separates the atria. What we find a remnant of a prenatal structure. It's called the fossa ovalis. Remember, fossa is an indentation and it's an oval shape. This is the remnant of what at one time, prenatally, was the foramen ovale, an oval hole. There was an opening between the right and left atrium that allowed for mixing of blood, because keep in mind, prenatally, the baby's lungs are not taking in air. That's not how the baby's blood is oxygenated, but rather the blood will travel out through umbilical vessels, and the oxygenation from the mother's blood will then bring the oxygen and nutrients through the placenta to the fetal circulation. So this is a structure in the heart, and you will see this also on the heart models in lab. Then there's an interventricular septum. Inter is, of course, between, and this is between the right and left ventricle. So this interventricular septum separates the ventricles, and here is an illustration of the gross anatomy of the heart, and this is actually showing you a sectioned area of the heart with a coronal or frontal section dividing the structure of the body into the anterior and posterior portions. Superior vena cava, here's the aorta. This is actually called the pulmonary trunk, and these are pulmonary arteries. Remember, A meaning away. Arteries always go away from the heart, and when the blood is being brought to the lungs by the pulmonary trunk branching to pulmonary arteries, it's carrying deoxygenated blood because it has to go to the lungs to pick up oxygen and get rid of CO2. Here we have pulmonary veins that are returning the blood from the lungs. These two right pulmonary veins that go behind the heart, and within this left atrium there's actually four. You may see four little circles representing the four pulmonary veins, bringing nice bright red oxygenated blood to the left atrium, and then of course it goes to the left ventricle and out through the aorta. You can actually see these four valves, AV valves, atrioventricular valves between the atrium and the ventricles. You've got the one over here on the right side, and of course we're looking at the heart just like as if you're looking at another person. To your left is going to be their right. So over here is the right atrioventricular valve. It's called the tricuspid valve because there's actually three cusps or flaps to this valve. And here is the bicuspid valve on the left atrioventricular valve. It's also called the mitral valve. It's the most famous valve because the left side of the heart, the left ventricle, has got the biggest job. It works under the highest pressure to pump blood out to the body. And so this is the mitral valve. Both of these valves need to close when the ventricles contract so that the blood will go out to the body, and of course on this side out to the lungs and not back up. So you can see here these are the cusps of the valve, and then these little stringy things right here are called chordae tendineae, and they actually, on both the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, we have these chordae tendineae anchoring the valve cusps into the interior of the ventricle, on the ventricle wall, and these are called papillary muscles, and they actually contract, keeping these valves tightly closed so that when the ventricles contract, they don't collapse backwards. There's another structure you can see in here, trabeculae carinae. This means like fleshy folds or meaty folds in the wall of the heart, and these are showing the superior and inferior vena cava, the aorta with the three branches that come off of this, and again we'll be studying the heart models in lab if we haven't already, and the different layers of the heart right here. landmarks on the heart. There's actually 3 sulci. Remember, a sulcus is a groove. And so there's actually 3 of these on the surface of the heart that hold blood vessels. There's the coronary sulcus, and this is the atrioventricular groove. So you can imagine a groove called the atrioventricular groove would be between the atria and the ventricles. So it goes in a horizontal area, horizontal orientation, and this encircles the junction of the atria and the ventricles. Then there's the anterior, in the front, interventricular sulcus. So it goes right down that area where the interventricular septum is located, but of course this is on the surface of the heart. Then you have a posterior interventricular sulcus along that goes between where the ventricles would be, but in the back of the heart. The atria are the receiving chambers. They're very small and thin-walled, and there's actually 3 major veins that empty into the right atrium: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. There's also smaller cardiac veins that empty into this area, but on the heart models particularly, we can actually see the areas that indicate where the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus enter into the right atrium. This is all deoxygenated blood. There are the 4 veins that I pointed out on the figure a few slides ago. These are pulmonary veins that empty into the left atrium. Nice bright red oxygenated blood. There are structures we call auricles. It's because it looks kind of like the ear auricle, that ear-shaped structure in the external ear. These auricles are on the surface of the atria. They're actually appendages. They have a lot of little areas inside that are kind of, when they're empty, they're all kind of folded up, but they can actually expand to increase the amount of blood returning to the atrium. When there's an increased blood return back to the heart, these auricles can actually expand, allowing a greater volume of blood to return to the heart. The ventricles are the discharging chambers. We consider these the pumps. They contain most of the blood volume. The right ventricle is actually on most of the anterior surface. So when you hear a right ventricle, it doesn't mean it's totally on the right. The heart's tipped a little bit in the thoracic cavity, so the right ventricle actually is a little bit anterior. The left ventricle is actually on the posterior-inferior surface, so it's not only tipped a little bit toward the back, but it's also inferior a bit. So the heart is somewhat oblique within the thoracic cavity. There's the trabeculae carinae that are inside of the ventricles that I pointed out on that figure. And there are the papillary muscles. Again, these are both within the ventricle walls. And then the chordae tendineae. And we can see those in the figures, and also they'll be pointed out in the heart models in lab. So the ventricles, these ventricle walls are much thicker than the atrial walls. These are primarily muscle. They're pumps. The right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary trunk, and I made the font blue representing deoxygenated blood. So the right ventricle pumps into the pulmonary trunk, and the left ventricle pumps into the aorta. And that would be nice, bright red oxygenated blood that has just returned to the heart from the lungs into the left atrium, and then the blood goes to the left ventricle. Left ventricle pumps into the aorta. And here is showing you the external structures of the heart, again, with various anatomical landmarks. And this is an actual cadaver heart showing the anterior aspect, and of course the pericardium is removed. We are going to be looking at pig hearts in lab, fresh pig hearts from a butcher, and it's very much like the human heart. Pig hearts are. So anyway, here's showing the aortic arch. It's got, and actually on the heart, there's often fat pads covering the surface. If a person has a lot of excess fat on the outside, often they will have this relative amount of internal, what we call visceral fat. But anyway, it's showing some fat on this structure right here. Pulmonary trunk would be anterior to that aortic arch. This is showing the little auricle over here on the right atrium and the auricle on the left atrium. And then here is your apex of the heart and the left ventricle, the right ventricle over here. And this is showing the a dissected heart where they're showing inside. You're looking here at, down here would be that right ventricle. And then you've got your left ventricle over here. You can somewhat see the valves, atrioventricular valves here. One, the one on the right would be your tricuspid. Over here is the bicuspid or mitral valve. You can see the chordae tendineae, papillary muscles, etc. And we'll be looking at this in lab. So the heart's valves ensure unidirectional flow. The blood has to go one way. The valves will open and close due to pressure changes. So as the pressure goes up behind the valve, it'll actually force the blood flow to go toward the area of lower pressure. There are two atrioventricular valves. These prevent backflow from the ventricles. All right, so the right AV valve, again, is called the tricuspid valve. The left atrioventricular valve is the mitral valve, also referred to as the bicuspid valve. The chordae tendineae actually will secure the valve cusps to the papillary muscles within the lining of the ventricles, within the inner ventricle wall. There's also two semilunar valves. I think of these as the, air quotes, exit doors. So these actually prevent backflow into the ventricles from the aorta on the left, or backflow from the pulmonary trunk back into the right ventricle. So there's the aortic semilunar valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. So that name definitely makes sense. When they named these valves, they thought they looked kind of like a half moon. And I don't really see it. But anyway, the aortic semilunar valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta, and the pulmonary semilunar valve would be between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And that name, of course, also makes sense. Pulmonary valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, which will is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk going to the lungs. And so this is showing the figure where you can show, it's showing how blood is flowing into and then out of the heart, and how the valves actually will guide that flow. So blood's returning to the heart, filling the atria, and showing both sides at once. And the valves are open. So as blood's returning to the heart, the atrioventricular valves are open. The semilunar valves are closed, however, so the blood can't get out yet. But the blood's freely coming into the atrium, and it's going then into the ventricles. As the ventricles fill, the AV flaps just are hanging limply into the ventricles. Then at the very last minute before the ventricles contract, the atria will contract, forcing a little bit extra blood into the ventricles. Then we can see the ventricles here are now beginning to contract, and that's going to force that AV valve cusps to close. All right, the AV valves will close now because the pressure is going up right here. The valves close, and then this is going to force the blood out of the heart. When these valve cusps are closing, the chordae tendineae that are secured to the papillary muscles will secure those valves so they don't collapse backwards. The papillary muscles contract and the chordae tendineae tighten, preventing the valve flaps from everting into the atria. And then as the ventricles contract and the intraventricular pressure rises, this higher pressure is going to force open the semilunar valves, and now the blood will flow out. Semilunar valves are open, so from the right ventricle, the blood will go out to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, and then from the left ventricle, blood will go out into the aorta. As the ventricles relax, then intraventricular pressure falls and blood is continuing to flow back from the arteries, and then it's going to actually, it actually causes these valves to close, the semilunar valves to close. So there's more pressure here in the aorta and the pulmonary trunk now, so that's going to cause these valves to close so that blood cannot go backwards into the ventricles. And this is showing a cross section, showing you where that section is obtained from, and they're showing you all these valves here. The myocardium would be this reddish area, the muscle. You can see the tricuspid, and then the bicuspid over here, or mitral, and then the semilunar valves there. And this is showing you an actual cadaver heart that corresponds with that figure. And this is looking inside of the heart, where you can actually see, this would be toward the atria up here and the ventricles. Inside the ventricle wall, the inner wall of the ventricles, you've got your papillary muscle that is securing these little chordae tendineae. And this would be the tricuspid valve. So which side of the heart is that found on? Yes, the right side. Okay, and this is showing you a cadaver photo. And one thing that you hopefully will notice very quickly when you're looking at the heart, the left ventricle is very thick compared to the right ventricle. Look at how thick these walls are. And this is, it would be an interventricular septum, so it's the middle part between the ventricles, but this whole left ventricle has a very thick myocardium, thick part of the myocardium. Okay, homeostatic imbalance. There's actually two conditions that can happen with the valves. You can have an incompetent valve. It's allowing backflow of blood. Then you can have valvular stenosis. Stenosis means stiffening, and this is the stiff valve cusp or flaps. Either one of these is not good, and so you don't want blood to backflow. You don't want to prevent the flow of blood when the valve's supposed to be open. So the treatment would be valve replacement. Okay, the pathways of blood. Blood goes from the right atrium past the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and then it will go into the pulmonary trunk. So this is within the heart. From the left atrium, blood passes the mitral valve or bicuspid valve into the left ventricle and then out the aorta. The pulmonary circuit, remember, we mentioned this before. In summary, blood goes from the right ventricle to the lungs and then back to the heart, the left atrium. But there's a lot of structures in between. And so I have a video that's online. It's called I'm a Little Blood Drop. And that's actually showing you where blood flows, naming every structure that it flows across or through. The systemic circuit is when blood goes from the left ventricle to the body, going through all the various blood vessels there, and then will return back to the heart, that is, back to the right atrium. And remember, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are bringing the blood into the right atrium from the body. And this is just showing the double pump going through what we just talked about. And it's really just a matter of going over and over and over where the blood is flowing and learning the names of all the structures. So with the circuit, it's kind of you can start in just about any place in the body, and then trace the flow of the blood around in the body, which structures it crosses, and then go all the way back to where you began. So if we start out, let's start out in the right atrium. And the blood is coming from superior vena cava, and this is deoxygenated blood returning from the upper part of the body. And then the inferior vena cava, that's the large vein carrying all the blood from the inferior part of the body. And also, remember, we've got our coronary sinus in the back that's carrying the deoxygenated blood from the heart muscle itself, which has its own coronary circulation. But anyway, all this blood's returning to the right atrium, passes the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, and they're showing this blood here. Then the blood goes past this pulmonary semilunar valve. There it is right here. And it's going to go into the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries. And then it goes to the lungs, and this is representing that deoxygenated blood going into from pulmonary arteries to pulmonary arterioles to the capillaries surrounding the alveoli in the air sacs in the lungs. Then it's going to, the blood will gather into larger and larger venules and veins. These are pulmonary veins, and they are going to be indicated in red because the blood here has been oxygenated, and it's going to go back to the heart through these 4 pulmonary veins. And these look like they're on the right side of the heart, but it's going in the back. There will be 4 openings to the left atrium. The blood passes the bicuspid or mitral valve right here, and it goes to the left ventricle, and then it will pass, and this is kind of hard to see, but back here you've got your aortic semilunar valve, so it's kind of behind this pulmonary trunk here. And then blood, so there it is right here, the aortic semilunar valve. Blood goes out into the aorta, going out into all the arteries and arterioles, carrying oxygenated blood to the body tissues. So there's equal volumes of blood pumped into each of the circuits, but the pulmonary circuit is very short. It only has to go from the heart to the lungs, and it's very low pressure. Low pressure. That's important. You don't want to blow out the tiny vessels in your lungs. The systemic circuit, this is a long circuit. It has to go all the way out to all the body tissues. It's under high pressure. In other words, there's higher friction here, and it's coming from the left ventricle. So the ventricle anatomy, the left ventricle walls are 3 times thicker than the right ventricle walls. And they're showing you this illustration to drive that point home. You can see the left ventricle over here and this little thin right ventricle that pumps under very low pressure to the lungs. Coronary circulation. You would think that when the blood is filled with heart, that would help supply, that would be a supply of oxygen to the entire myocardium. But the myocardium is thick. It needs its very own circulation of blood. We call it the coronary circulation. It supplies the blood or the oxygenated blood to the heart muscle itself. And each time the heart muscle relaxes, this flow of blood can go out to the heart muscle. And the majority of energy actually is needed by the left ventricle. So the majority of coronary circulation is going to the left ventricle. It actually varies between individuals, and it has many anastomosis or junctions. So each individual is slightly different locations where these arteries and veins are located. Coronary arteries. These exit from the base of the aorta, therefore they're carrying oxygenated blood. The left coronary artery will lead to the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. Medical students can memorize this, as you can too. LCA, left coronary artery. it is also these letters can be used for the on the left, the circumflex artery, C, and the anterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery leads to the posterior interventricular artery and the right marginal artery. RPM, which is revolutions per minute, they talk about that for how quickly a vehicle is going, a vehicle on wheels. And so this could represent RPM. The right coronary artery leads to the P, posterior interventricular artery, and the right marginal artery, marginal M. And this is an illustration showing you the major coronary arteries that serve the myocardium with oxygenated blood. And of course, we have coronary or cardiac veins that is now bringing that blood the blood that is provided oxygen to the myocardium now will be collected into veins. We call them cardiac veins, and this is going to return that oxygen poor blood, which I put in blue font, to the right atrium. There's actually there's actually more than that, but there's a great cardiac vein, and there's that lies in this anterior interventricular sulcus in front of the heart, and then the middle cardiac vein that actually lies in a posterior interventricular sulcus, and then the small cardiac vein. These all gather together into a large vein behind the heart. It's called the coronary sinus. So it looks very large. It's behind the heart, and it will bring blood to the right atrium. And there's a few other anterior cardiac veins that will empty directly into the right atrium as well. And this is showing you the coronary circulation, the major cardiac veins. And they're showing the illustration here. This would be in the posterior view, posterior surface. There's that huge coronary sinus, and this is bringing blood back to the right atrium. This is actually showing that little auricle out there. But inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and the coronary sinus are bringing blood to the right atrium. Problems with cardiac blood supply. There's a term called angina pectoris. This is just pain around the area of the heart. What's really significant with this is it could be a symptom of what we call a myocardial infarction. An infarct is a blockage. So this is actually a blockage of one or more of the coronary arteries. This can actually lead to a fatal arrhythmia of the heart, and we call this a heart attack. So microscopically, the anatomy of the cardiac muscle fibers are somewhat different than skeletal muscle. If you remember with one of the very first units in lab in biology 263, we had tissues that you looked at under the microscope. There was skeletal muscle or striated, then there was cardiac muscle, and then of course smooth muscle. So with cardiac muscle, there's actually a connective tissue matrix, and this is called the endomysium, that connects the cells to what we call the cardiac skeleton. It actually forms a little framework. Cardiac muscle has a lot of capillaries, and there are many large mitochondria. The cardiac muscle cells have intercalated discs, which hopefully you remember these when you looked at them under the microscope and when we did the histology unit in Bio 263. Intercalated discs are junctions between the cells. There's desmosomes that actually hose the cells together, and gap junctions. So here, and pretty much we identified intercalated discs as an area where the ions can pass from cell to cell. So this action potential can travel from cell to cell. This is not true with skeletal muscle. So the heart is actually a functional, we call it a syncytium. So the chambers contract as a unit. First, the atria contract. The left and right atrium will contract at the same time as a unit, and then shortly thereafter, the ventricles. So the muscle cells contract together, and it's really important that they all contract at the same time. Otherwise, you have an uncoordinated rhythm of the heart, and it would not be compatible with life. And here's that familiar picture. You can see the intercalated discs here, and this is showing you the gap junctions and the desmosomes. And this is actually showing you a little bit more closely the microscopic anatomy of cardiac muscle. And yes, there's the actin and the myosin, and you've got the sarcolemma, the cell membrane on the outside. There's lots of mitochondria, etc. And that's the end of part A. Have a wonderful day. I will see you with part B.